Democracy and Development. He has authored and edited 5 important books: Right to Work on Rural India, Working of the Mahatma Gandhi National Rural Employment Guarantee Scheme, by SAFE, and Subaltern, Exclusion and Social Change in India, published by Cambridge University, 2014. And Subalternity and Social Change in India, published by Routledge, 2018. Social Sector Development in Northeast India, published by SAGE Publication in 2020. The Inclusive Development through Guaranteed Employment in India's MGNREGS experiences scheme is forthcoming. Other than this very important edited books, Dr. Pankaj is leading about 2 dozen research and evaluation projects for various national and international organizations. He has contributed numerous articles and reviews of professional journals like South Asia Research, Contribution to Indian Sociology, Journal of Asian and African Studies, Economic and Political Weekly, International Studies, Journal of Commonwealth and Comparative Politics, Social Sciences, Contemporary South Asia, Poverty and Focus, among others. He is also on the editorial board of some of the leading social science journals.
Right, sir. Okay. So we got a couple of response, and then it seems that it's audible. So thank you very much for being present with us. Due to some technical glitches, we were disrupted, and now we can resume the talk. So I told you in the beginning that our center here. We recently have written a book on social sector development in Northeast India, and we thought that we can share some of the thoughts which have been presented in this book. But here, just confined to poverty-related issues of Northeast India, not the other issues which have been covered. So that's why we meditated how social sector development will lead to poverty alleviation in Northeast India. Before we give some understanding, some explanation of how social sector development could lead to poverty alleviation in Northeast India, let me just give some kind of a glimpse of the poverty status in Northeast India. What is the level of poverty in different states of Northeast India? What has been the trend over the last 2 decades in terms of reduction or in terms of increase? Is there any social significance of poverty in Northeast India? When we talk of Northeast India, we include and that makes it 8 states. Normally, we identify Northeast India with 7 sisters, which were carved. Most of them were carved out of Assam, but we include Sikkim also as a part of Northeast India, and that's why the count is 8. Northeast India altogether is a spread of over about 8% of the total geographical area of the country, and about 4% of the total population of the country resides in the Northeast India. So in a way, there are many other importance and significance of Northeast India. One is very important significance is a strategic location. 99.5% of Northeast boundary are shared with other countries, and that means we have the external boundaries. So this reason is very significant for us, not only from the point of view, but also from the point of view that about 4% of the population, 8% of the geographical area constitute Northeast India. So just in terms of a kind of glimpse of Northeast poverty in Northeast India, a very interesting thing is that when we look at the overall development scenario in Northeast India, most of the states are low-income states except Sikkim and Mizoram, which have relatively much higher income per capita income. Sikkim, of course, has the highest per capita income Northeast states, but other states have very low per capita income. But when you look at the other development features of Northeast India, say particularly education and health, that we broadly consider these 2 sectors broadly considered the part of social sector development. Then on the front of education and health, Northeast Indian states are much better than many of the states with relatively much higher per capita income. And there are some specific reasons for that. We will explain a little bit about those also. But when we look at the poverty figure, then the scenario is not good. In fact, in many of the states of Northeast India, the poverty ratio is higher than the national average. And in that states, there are three states. One is Arunachal Pradesh, another Assam, and third is Manipur. But most important thing is that Assam is in the state which has poverty ratio which is higher than the national average. And this is significant because Assam is the state where 68% of Northeast population reside in that state. So if Assam is included in the state category with higher than national poverty, in a sense we can say that a very large proportion of Northeast Indian population are poor, and they are poor than the poverty ratio is higher than the national average in these states and a large part of the population. Then there are other states in which rural poverty is much higher than the national average, and there are the four states: Arunachal Pradesh, Assam, Mizoram, and Manipur. And I would like to mention that by and large, northeastern states are rural states. A large part of the population reside in rural areas. So rural poverty is equally significant, and that gives a good idea that poverty is highly concentrated in rural areas, and the four states have higher than the national average in terms of rural poverty. And urban poverty is relatively higher in three states: Arunachal Pradesh, Manipur, Nagaland. But urban poverty is not so important, largely because the total share in urban population is very small, and these three states have very small overall population figure in terms of absolute number when we take the northeastern states together. But then there is a trend in terms of poverty reduction. When we look at the trend in terms of two phases, the first phase we can say from 1993-94 to 2004-05, and the second phase is from 2004-05 to 2011-12, for which we have this data which were collected, which were tabulated, and based on this data, in the first phase, poverty declined but more robust in most of the states, and in the second phase, poverty declined but not so robust. Of course, it declined, but poverty declined but a little, or there was a little slowdown in terms of poverty decline in most of the states northeast in the second phase, that is between 2004-05 to 2011-12. The only two exceptions are Sikkim and Tripura, and these two exceptions are largely because these two states spend a large part of their budget on the welfare programs and poverty alleviation schemes, and they also put a lot of emphasis in effective implementation of the various central government programs, various central government schemes, which played important role in poverty reduction in these two states, Tripura and Sikkim, during 2004-05 and 2011-12. But in other states, poverty decline was relatively slow compared to the first phase, that was between 93-94 to 2004-05. However, during this 93-94 and 2004-05, and then when we compare the 2004-05 to 11-12, then we see that in 93-94 to 2004-05 period, poverty declined but much sharper in most of the states, including Arunachal, Assam, Manipur, Meghalaya, and Nagaland, whereas in 2004-05 and 11-12 period, poverty decline was sharper only in Tripura and Sikkim. In a sense, we can say that the range, or rather the spread of poverty decline was wider in the first phase, that was between 93-94 to 2004-05, than in the second phase, in which the sharp decline happened in two states, and these two states are also very small states. So essentially, we can say that if we take the whole liberalization phase, then the initial first 10 decades were very important in terms of poverty in Northeast India, but that slowed down after 2004-05. In fact, after 2004-05 and between 2004-05 and 11-12, poverty increased in three states: Arunachal Pradesh, Mizoram, and Nagaland. And in Arunachal, this increase was mainly because of increase in rural poverty, but in Nagaland, there was an increase in urban poverty also. So When we look at this poverty figure in terms of some composition in population section, then there are two, three very interesting trends which need to be explained and which need to be discussed. The first is that this the minority groups in all northern states have relatively higher poverty concentration. Say, for example, Muslims in Assam, Hindus in Mizoram, and Buddhists in Arunachal. So, poverty ratio is much higher in these three groups in these three states, largely because these three groups constitute minority population in these three states. Muslims in Assam, Hindus in Mizoram, and Buddhists in Arunachal Pradesh. So, in a sense, there is some kind of relation between minority status and high incidence of poverty. At least the three states figure suggests so. The second important social characteristic of poverty is that it is concentrated in agrarian, in casual labor in agriculture, in rural areas and urban area. It is also found in self-employed. That means the self-employed category is not, we can say, a good employment in northeastern areas, because there is the incidence of poverty is relatively higher in even self-employed category. Normally, in self-employed category, the incidence of poverty is less, but in northeastern state, particularly urban areas, there is high incidence of poverty even in self-employed category. But in rural areas, casual labor in agriculture in all states have high incidence of poverty. Then another interesting thing is that apart from poverty, there is also a high level of unemployment in northeastern states against all India figure of 8.3% of an unemployment rate. All India figure of 6.1% as per periodic labor force survey data 2017-18. In Northeast India, it was 8.3%. But when we look at the unemployment rate among the youth, then it's much higher in northern states against all India figure of 17.8%. It was 56% in Nagaland, 35% in Manipur, 28.6% in Mizoram, 27% in Assam, and 26% in Arunachal. But when we look at the malnutrition status in children, then we found that in most of the states, the condition was better. And malnutrition, in fact, there is very interesting trend of malnutrition in children in northeastern states, that most of the children enter malnutrition stage after breastfeeding period, that is after 36 to 54 months. That means northeastern states practice relatively longer period of breastfeeding, and that also explains one of the regions of relatively less malnutrition in the breastfeeding period than in the post breastfeeding period. And then post breastfeeding period, they have the immediate problem of nutrition, and that needs be given attention, because this is the phase when also some kind of intervention by the government starts in terms of the ICDS centers. And now there is under new education policy, Discovery education also talks about providing nutrition at this stage as well. So this gives a kind of some kind of glimpse of the poverty status in Northeast India, which clearly shows that in important states of Northeast India, particularly Assam, poverty incidence is higher than the national average. But in most of the states, poverty ratio is there, and then there is a sharp divide between urban and rural areas. Poverty is highly concentrated in rural areas, largely because northeastern states are largely rural areas, and very small proportion of population live in urban areas. But in urban areas, incidence of poverty has increased in some states in recent years, and in these states also unemployment rate in urban area has increased in recent years. So in a sense, there is some kind of connection between unemployment and increase in poverty in urban areas of the states. But in rural areas, the incidence of poverty has increased in one state, particularly Arunachal Pradesh, that needs attention. But at a whole, it's highly concentrated in rural areas. Another important feature of this northeastern states poverty is that those population which constitute minority within the state, they have relatively high incidence of poverty, whether it's Hindus, in Mizoram and Buddhist in Himachal or Muslims in Assam. So this gives some kind of very it's a okay, okay. So now, since there are continuous some technical problems, we can quickly come to this how social sector development is significant for Northeast India and how it is important for poverty reduction in Northeast India. Those who are familiar with the geographical conditions and ecological situation of Northeast India ought to be aware of the fact that there are certain limitations in expanding agriculture as well as industry. Uh, Most of the states in Northeast India are hilly states with very fragile ecology and limited land for having agriculture. Assam and Tripura are the two states which own most of the plain lands, and other states are mostly hilly. So, in a sense, agriculture has limitation in terms of availability of land, and it can't be expanded beyond these two states when we try because other states are largely hilly states. In fact, there are already problems because of zone cultivation in some of the states, and that practice is declined because zone cultivation leads to ecological damage to the local ecology of the region. So, expansion of agriculture has limited scope, and that constrained the development of the primary sector activities because that are largely based on agriculture activity. Of course, there could be other primary sector activity in terms of horticulture, in terms of fisheries, but agriculture in itself has limitation because except Assam and Tripura, other states are largely in the area. Then the scope for development of secondary sector is there. It's not ruled out, but again, it has to be of different nature. And another big issue is that this industrial development in Northeast India is also constrained by environment and ecological concerns. For example, timber was an important industry in Northeast India once upon a time, but once it led to a large kind of large deforestation in large parts of the area, and then the Supreme Court passed an order to stop the timber-based industry. There are some other industries, probably big extraction of natural resources, but then again, there are serious hazards of extraction of natural resources. Say, for example, a large part of Jaintia Hills in Meghalaya have become denuded of forest because of extraction of limestone, which are sold to nearby Bangladesh. So then there are some other serious ecological challenges in Northeast India. There are a number of hydroelectric projects, but there are also widespread protests against those hydroelectric projects because they are not ecologically very conducive for the region. So, in a sense, agriculture and the industry, particularly of modern big industry type, have limitation in expansion in Northeast India. And that's why we argue that given the constraint of expansion of agriculture and industry, Northeast India should be given attention for the development of social sector, which doesn't need much of land, rather which is based on development of human capital, which is based on development of human population, and that can be a good resource to be cultivated in Northeast India. And Northeast India has certain advantages as well in terms of human capital formation, and that also emphasizes the argument that they can actually capitalize on the strength which Northeast Indian states have already built in terms of human capital formation. So there are a couple of regions on which we argue that social sector development should be given attention, should be given focus in northeastern India, because a large part of the population which are still stuck in poverty and which have limited mobility, limited scope to escape poverty, because most of them are caught in private sector, most of them are in rural areas, and I mentioned earlier that there is a high concentration of poverty in India. The need to be set from that sector, that segment, because that segment has limited space for mobility, limited space for expansion. But service sector has potentially much larger scope to expand in Northeast India and also to provide employment to a large number of population, because there is a very strong relation between employment and poverty reduction. And even Northeast India, we saw that in recent years in urban areas, there has been increase in poverty incidence in some states, but this increase is correlated with increase in unemployment rate in those states as well. So a couple of regions are there for giving attention to social sector development in Northeast India for poverty eradication. The first is that since agriculture industry have a limitation in terms of expanding beyond a certain capacity, there is a need to give attention to expansion of service sector. The expansion of industry is also constrained by the problem of land acquisition in northeastern India, because a large part of northeastern land are covered or protected under the sixth schedule of the concession, and that gives a kind of autonomy to the local community, and that the land belongs to the local community. The land acquisition has to be based on the concept of local community in that area, and it has been found that given this kind of arrangement, and there are also a large number of tribal groups who hold the land, and then having a kind of developing consensus among all the group to participate the land is very difficult proposition. So if we need huge amount of land, in any case land is restricted because of the forest and hill areas, then there are constraints, and this constraint is also because of the fact that land belongs to in many states community. There are different kind of land system in many states. There are lands which are protected by sixth schedule, so it's not very easy to even procure land for a big mega industry, and that's why it constrains the expansion of such kind of industry. Similar is the constraint for the expansion of agriculture in most of the states except Tripura and Assam, which have some plain area. So productivity of agriculture can of course be increased, and that would create significant impact. But in Assam, flood is a constant problem, and that in fact restrict the scope in terms of unless until we address the flood problem, which has also some kind of a kind of implication in the sense that the flood is not because of us, and the flood is also because our neighboring countries, many of the rivers originate from there. Many of the neighboring countries during the rainy season, they release water to this part of the land, and then it floods some of these estates. So the controlling of flood has also some kind of limitation, and that's why because of this limitation, we say that perhaps social sector can be a better option. Second important point is that northeastern states have much greater prospect for social sector development, largely because they have already reached a relatively high level of literacy. Except Assam and Arunachal Pradesh, most of the northeastern states have literacy rates which are much higher than the national average. And in terms of female literacy, only Arunachal lags behind the national average, but most of the other states are above the national average. In Assam also, this literacy, the overall literacy is dragged down because of the low literacy rate in only some section of population, particularly the immigrant population, and also the tea garden population. But in the rest part of the Assam literacy rate is also high. Northeast Indian workers are generally, it has been found that in a couple of industries they are being favored, particularly airlines, hospitality industry, then call centers, and there are anecdotal reports, there are newspaper reports which suggest that most of these industries favor workers from Northeast India, and that, in a sense, gives a kind of feeling that people have greater aptitude to take up such kind of industries, and that also gives a reason to utilize the resource of for promotion of service sector in northeastern states. A third very important feature of northeastern states is that of Northeast India is relatively young compared to population of many other states of India. When we look at the population in terms of 0 to 5 age group, then 52% of all India population is in 0 to 25 age group, whereas it is 62.3% in Meghalaya, 58.76% in Arunachal Pradesh, 58.40% in Nagaland, and 54.73% in and 54.73% in Mizoram and 54.54% in Assam. In other words, in 5 states of Northeast India, 0 to 25 age group population is much higher than the national average of 52%. When we look at 0 to 14 age population, again, there are 5 states in which the population group population in this group is much higher than the national average. In a sense, it indicates that relatively there is much higher level of young age population in northeastern states, that suggests that if we catch this group of population, then for coming 30-40 years, we will have a large number of productive and skillful workers in northern states. In a sense, it has very clear advantage of having a larger ended population who could be utilized for productive purposes for a relatively much longer period of time compared to other states which are facing the problem of aging population, which are the facing of a declining ratio of working age population. So this demographic phase of Northeast India needs to be captured and needs to be utilized for having much longer period of getting demographic dividend for removal, also for removal of poverty in the states, but overall development of northeastern region. Then another important reason why northeastern states, social sector development of northeastern states is important, that this will also increase mobility of population from northeastern India to other part of India, and many of the industry could also possibly limited to the nature which we have explained earlier could shift to the northeastern India. This will lead to much greater integration of the region with the rest of the India than what we have at present. And for that matter, it's also important to, for example, if there is high level of social sector development, high level of skilled manpower in northeastern India, generally it has been found that high skilled worker has greater mobility for occupation, for economic purposes than the low skilled labor, and the high skilled labor migration is also more remunerative in the sense that they earn much better than the unskilled labor. Once the skilled labor migrate to the other parts of the country, they also have the chance of mixing with the other population, intermingling with the other sections of society, and then in that way there will be a process of much greater interaction between the population of Northeast India as well as Northeast India and rest of India, rest of India. At the same time, what will happen that when Northeast India would be known for high skilled worker, many of the public sector industry will try to shift in those areas because after globalization, a trend has been formed that capital moves to the place where they get cheaper labor, although the restriction in terms of labor continue to be there, but capital flies to the regions where they can get easily cheap labor. This also builds a case for much greater level of social sector development of Northeast India that will help in better integration or greater integration of the region with the rest of India. That remains, in fact, a kind of challenge, partly because of its geographical isolation, but also because of less and less kind of transaction or between the people of Northeast India and the rest of India. So, so I think this is the brief about this understanding of poverty level in Northeast India, and then how social sector development is significant for poverty eradication in Northeast India, as well as for overall development in Northeast India. But before I end this, let me just give some kind of glimpse about the status of social sector development in Northeast India. As I mentioned in the beginning, that most of the states of Northeast India have relatively high level of social sector development, particularly education and health indicators are quite good, quite better in some of the states. And in fact, interesting thing is that if you compare the per capita income of northeastern states with some other states, then they are not as good. But if you compare their social sector development indicator, they are much better. So, in a sense, this explains some other phenomenon that, in spite of low per capita income, northeastern states have been able to achieve much better level of education and health development. It's a kind of a model like Kerala, which is widely talked of because of its high level of human development, or for that matter, Himachal Pradesh, or even at international level, Sri Lanka from South Asia is known for low income and yet very high level of development. In a sense, Northeast present that kind of situations with low per capita income, it has relatively high level of social development, particularly education and health. And there are, of course, some regions for that. For example, education in three states, Mizoram, Nagaland, Meghalaya, and other states also, there was early penetration of Christian missionaries, and they had, of course, their own logic to provide education, but that also helped in early kinds of penetration of education in the masses in the states. Uh, Then the other interesting feature of social sector development in northeastern India is that if we look these states in terms of all India ranking, then interesting thing is that there is a wide variation in the rank which northeastern states occupy in a map of all India ranking. Say, for example, in a all India rank of 31 states and union territories, Sikkim is at rank 4, Mizoram at rank 5, Nagaland at rank 9, Meghalaya at rank number 12, Manipur at 19, Tripura at 23, and Assam 25. The sad part is that that Assam, which has the largest share of population, is at the bottom in terms of social sector development index of Northeast India. But other states, Sikkim, Mizoram, Nagaland, Meghalaya, the smaller states have really done much better in terms of social sector development. And of course, there are some other regions, say, for example, some of these states were carved out of Assam, and then once they were made a smaller state, there was much greater attention in terms of governance, in terms of development. Development were also brought closer to the people, and that could also explain why some of these states were able to do much better after formation of states, after carving out certain part of territory from Assam. When we look at some of the data in terms of literacy rate, in terms of health indicators, we see that the picture is good in terms of IMR, in terms of institutional delivery, in terms of literacy rate, in terms of uh, uh, other demographic indicators in terms of, say, for example, sex ratio. And the total fertility rate is problematic. It is higher in most states. Similarly, this fully immunization of children, the proportion is also higher in some of the states. Lower, in fact, lower in some of the states. That indicates low access to health facilities. Uh, but when we look at the income status of the states, then as I mentioned that Sikkim is the state with high per capita income among the northeastern states. Other states lag behind all India average in terms of per capita income. Uh, in terms of access to basic amenities, in terms of other economic indicators, most of the states were poorly on these indicators, but in spite of the fact that they fare poorly on economic indicators, on basic amenities, they do quite well in terms of social sector indicators, particularly education and health, and that explains that northeastern states, because of a relatively high level of social sector development, can also can also be in fact nurtured for much high level of human capital formation in the region, and which could be a strategic goal of development for northeastern states. And this also brings us to the kind of suggestion that so far the goal of development in northeastern states has been defined in terms of development of infrastructure, in terms of national integration, with a very heavy national security concern. And we argue that by giving social attention to social sector development, we can achieve all those goals, perhaps with much greater and much better results, even in terms of national integration, as we argued that social sector development led national integration of northeastern states could be more sustainable because it will provide two-way traffic between the people of northeastern states as well as rest of India, and that's why there are a couple of regions which we have emphasized in our talk that need that social sector development in Northeast India need to be given much bigger attention than so far given to this sector in the region. And that also speaks of perhaps a suggestion in terms of we need to look at our strategy and change our policy towards Northeast India from heavy infrastructure, a national security dominated perspective to a human capital formation based service sector development, which will be people centric, which will be decentralized, and which will be also closer to the people of these states. And that would also lead a big strike on the poverty reduction in some of the states where still there are high ratio of poverty. So with these words, I'd like to close my talk here, and I'd like to thank all of you for listening to me. Thank you so much. Now, perhaps we can have some interaction if we you can raise any query, or you can raise a point, or you can.
Question. Is there any question from the participant? I think Professor Yadav.
Yeah. Can I raise a question?
Please.
See, you emphasize agriculture. There's a lot of scope for horticulture. You mentioned it, but need to be a little more. Still more scope for generating through tourism. Now, that hospitality and tourism, in the present situation, it may not be working, but in the long term, It has a lot of scope. For instance, Manipur, that uh, the lake where the floating garden situation is there. It's much richer than even the Dal Lake in Srinagar. Now, those kind of things also need mention when you talk of the Northeast economy and situations development.
Yes, of course, tourism needs to be exploited in Northeast India, and that's why tourism will also be emphasized on service sector that and tourism is a part of service sector that because there is limitation to exploit agriculture and industry beyond a point. But these are the sectors which can be. There are still huge untapped potentialities of these sectors which need to be tapped. And tourism is one of them. In fact, when we look at the data, then still Northeast India is not very high on the map of tourists, so that sector can be tapped in the states. But then there is a different political problem in these states that most of the states are insisting for this inner line permit, and that is not very conducive for promotion of tourism industry. That, in a sense, would restrict the movement of the people, would also restrict the development of such kind of sector in these states.
Yeah, the tourist line, the inner line permit is required because, as you rightly say, neighboring countries, the boundaries have with neighboring countries, and a lot of unrest disturbances are there. But still, there is a scope. Because I said it, this Manipur lake is so big and so beautiful, it can be done. Now, only way is to increase structure for transport. Because once you are there, you are not sure when the next flight will come back or not come back. Because I've been a couple of times there. That difficulty. But I think the present government or the coming in the last few years, development of infrastructure, particularly the transport and communication and airline services, will lead to some kind of relaxation or permit to inner line permit also. And the tourism has a scope because compare the lake, compare that lake, even horticulture, you see small countries, you can grow fruit and then fruit could be a good business. Once economy is linked, things will develop. And depending upon how you rightly said, land is not there, but you cannot remain on agriculture itself. What can be done there, that should be done, and to some extent that's being done also.
This needs to be somehow even this. Of course, there has been significant improvement in infrastructure after this government. They have given a lot of attention to promoting various means of transport, communication, linking one part from the state to another part of the state, and even one part of the region to another part of the region. But what I was suggesting that there is contradictory development in the sense that this inner line permit system is being demanded by more and more states recently. Meghalaya, the center didn't agree, but state did on its own. They have introduced some kind of registration system when somebody will go to. The point is that in such a region, such kind of restriction would generally discourage tourists. Suppose that somebody has come to Assam, he wants to go to Arunachal, he wants to go to Meghalaya, then he will have to seek two permission, one to while going to Arunachal, the to Meghalaya. This needs to be looked into, and it's not because the Indian government is, in fact, rather it's a local demand, and perhaps we have to develop a more better solution of how this local demand of restricting the movement of people can be accommodated, because that also in a sense restrict the scope for development, whether we are talking of service sector development or even the tourism development. Restriction restrict development as well, restriction of movement restrict development as well.
Thank you, sir.
Thank you,
Professor
Dr.
Pankaj.
Pankaj. This is a picture of 8 states. It's no doubt challenging because
Giving a picture of socio-economic
profile
profile
of
of a
the one
particular
state
one
is
state
one.
is one thing, but in your thing presentation you have given 8 states. It is no doubt challenging and most important thing you have tried to link the social sector development with poverty alleviation in Northeast India.
Dr. Pankaj,
Uh,
the
talk
talk
was mostly on evidence
based
based figures
that has
that has
strengthened
strengthened
his
his
strategy and his
strategy and his advocacy
advocacy
for
for
very
the
comprehensive
comprehensive
development in
development of
Northeast states. And
and
being
being
starting
starting
with
with
Professor Pankaj says poverty ratio in the Northeast states is much higher than the other national average. That too more
in
in
the
the
rural
rural
community.
poverty.
What
What
most
most
important
importantly,
for the Northeast
Northeast
states
states is just
is
not a
not a
monolithic
monolithic
or
or
one
one
geographic
geographic
entity. As
as
his
his
other
other
figure
figures
says, also malnutrition is little better. Although we have got a poverty rate is higher, but malnutrition is little better. Similarly, the literacy rate is also better than national average. So his argument was that it might be because of the longer period of breastfeeding and the problems that are rise for mostly for poverty stage. That he also very
clearly
clearly
pointed out
pointed out the
limited
limited
mobility and
mobility and
expansion
expansion of agriculture is also limited. And
and
it's
no
no
doubt
doubt
Northeastern
northeastern
states
states
is in
is
a
in a
contradiction
contradiction
because
because
one
at
time
one
we
time we see there are certain
indicators
indicators which is highly
highly
developed
developed
compared to national
national
average,
average.
but there
There
are
are
certain
certain
indicators
indicators
which is lower
lower
than
than
this thing. In
in
this
this
thing,
thing.
Professor
Professor
Pankaj
Pankaj has
has pointed
pointed
out
out
that
we have to shift the approach
the
from
approach from
development policy
development policy from top-down infrastructure focus to bottom-up,
people
people-centric and social sector development focus.
and
And
his
his concern
concern
is
is
that
that
we
we
should
should
not
not
treat
treat
Northeast states as a geographical entity and a
a
monolithic
monolithic
sociocultural society, ignoring its rich ethnic diversities, cultural
culture
pluralities,
pluralities
and
and
regional variation. Thank you,
thank you,
Professor
Dr.
Pankaj,
Pankaj,
for
for
bringing
bringing
such
such
a
a
social
social
science
science perspective
perspective to
to
entire
entire
development
development
of
of
the
the
Northeast
states,
states, and
and
also
also
more
more
importantly,
importantly,
how
how
best we can alleviate
alleviate
the
the
poverty in
poverty in
these
the
states
states
if we take
take
into
into
account
account
the
the
diversity of the
diversity
Northeast
Northeast states.
states.
Thank you,
Thank you,
Dr.
Professor
Pankaj.
Pankaj.
Yes.
I
I must
must
thank
thank
also
also
my
my
colleague
colleagues, Mr.
Kumar,
Kumar, Dr.
Dr.
Mary
Mary
Tanmay,
Tanmay,
and
and
Dr.
Dr.
Prasad
Prasad
for
for
their
the
coordination
coordination
and
and
making
helping
this
this
webinar
webinar
to a
a
great
great
success.
success.
And
And
also
also
we
we
see
see
there's
there's
a
a
lot
lot
of
of
participation
participation
from
from
different
different
stakeholders
stakeholders and
and academic
academic
institution
institutions,
in this thing. And
and
we
we
will
will
take
take
your
your
support
support
and
and
help
help
also
also
in
in
our
our
future
future.
webinars. Thank
Thank
you
you
very
very
much.
much.
Thank you.